Hello and welcome to the next lecture, lecture number 20, and this is a tutorial and a very different kind of a tutorial. The other tutorials were meant to help you with readings, extra readings by defining some of the cultural or historical or other terms and information which keep recurring in several texts. But this is a different one, so we are not going to talk about any particular terms or concepts or terminologies. But basically, this tutorial's aim is to help use the past in understanding some of what is happening in the present, and what better way to do it than to use COVID-19 to understand so much of what we have been discussing in this course, especially the last few lectures, particularly on the topic of epidemics. And so most often, so even before when I had offered this course to students, it's just basically what we learn from the text or at most some photos or newspaper clippings of that time. So, but now, recently, when I am offering this course, like I'm doing now, in this NPTEL form, so there is that for all the disadvantages that COVID had, so now we, at least from this point of view, there is one small advantage that we can actually sense, have a real feeling of how things would have been at that time. So the opportunity to live through COVID has provided many of us that special capacity, that sensitivity to comprehend and to be able to imagine the kind of constraints, horrors and difficulties faced not only by the people but also by the state, the health authorities during pandemics of the past. And so as you can appreciate, this is of special relevance to this course, and especially to this point where at this point where we had just finished talking about public health at large and epidemics in particular. And why this is particularly relevance to this course is that we can see the COVID pandemic through some of the same kinds of issues and frames that we had come across in the study of the historical cases. So the interplay of various factors like medicine, culture, the role of the state, role of the media, so the international dimensions and the pressures and all of those things, cooperation, all of those things. And so one of the most direct connections that can be drawn from this course to the COVID-19 scenario is that something which we just only recently discussed, which was that the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, the Colonial Act, was straight brought to 2019. So as you would have noticed, so we didn't discuss too much about what the act actually contained. We just kept saying the act was invoked and people did this, that and all that, but not in too much detail. So I had reserved all that so that we can actually live through in a sense, because we had just recently gone through. So now we will know in a very personal way what are the various provisions of that act, and how in this current situation, in this current century, it was implemented right in our own lives. Like for instance, so the same act, 1897 act, was what provided for the compulsory closing of our schools and colleges, cinema halls and other public places like swimming pools and other that. So this is the provisions of the act which gave powers to the government to do any kind of inspection and inquiry entering anywhere. So even for instance hostels, because there was a time when there was not a total lockdown, so institutions were allowed to function either in the early stages of the pandemic or when lockdown was relaxed. But still, government servants, IAS officers could come to the hostel, for instance, come to the institute, ask the director to be taken to particular hostels, knock on the rooms, talk to students. How is your mess being organized? Are you having sufficient social distancing? Are you having some kind of a roster system, so whereby everyone is not going to the mess at the same time? So what kind of distance is maintained between you and another person who is coming to eat, or what's the kind of bathroom arrangements, or so many hundreds of you using some 8 bathrooms, or so those kinds of things the government, so many of you would have experienced or seen on the TV. So checking the kinds of preparations, precautions, distances, and also what we saw was a very meticulous recording of the information of travel, especially this term contact history became very prevalent. So who are the kinds of people who we contacted, who were the ones who they contacted, where did they come from, did they contact someone who came from there, who came from, would have brought that from there, those kinds of things. And so this was the same act which provided for imposition of quarantines, isolations, even of course at that time face mask was not a big element during the plague or other pandemics, but then the act was now used to make compulsions like face masks. And once the mask came, then also very particularities about the mask. It should not be just a cloth mask. It should be reasonably, if not N95 or whatever, at least this level of efficacy should be there in the mask, all that. And of course, as many of us experienced, so we were prevented from most kinds of congregations at the public meetings, or even things like going to temple, mosque, or mass in churches and things like that. And similarly, the prohibition and restriction of the functioning of shops and other commercial establishments like cinema halls, except things which were doling out basic necessities. So we should remember the purpose of all this is that so these are the kinds of things that people would have undergone at that time, and you should remember that the situation at that time was different. It was a colonial state, and then something which was seen to be imposed by alien power, someone different from us. So, but still, so whoever it is, whatever the color of the or the origins of the people who came or brought this law or implemented it, the kinds of restrictions were the same. So the state, so in the state, our state, not the colonial state, so an independent state at the central and state level. So they had coercive powers to, if these things were not followed, so either enforcing it strictly on the individual or owners of public commercial enterprises. So this could involve sealing of entry and exit from particular streets. So some of you would have been gone through that unfortunate situation where your entire street was sealed off. None of you from the 10 or 12 houses in that street could go out, and even if it's for essential things, so things would be arranged to be delivered. So it may not be even streets, even entire areas, or sometimes people, so in most cases, people couldn't go out of their states, and so there's special kinds of passes had to be obtained for going out or entering to another state. And so that is using your own private vehicle or by own foot or all. But even with regard to public and private transport, so whether it's road or air, so there were a lot of restrictions and banning of vehicular movement. And the same act was what provided for the state governments to inspect people or quarantine people arriving into the particular area, the state, by whatever means, air or rail or road or sea. And not only that, so there was also provision to exercise control on the media, any kind of media, the print or visual or the more modern thing which was not there during those epidemics. So the social media, so which itself can be an epidemic, as we will see. So the state could exercise control on of them again. So all of this in the name of public health. So as we have been saying throughout the course, so in the name of the public health, the state could extend its long arm in the name of the particular urgency of the situation, exigency of the situation. So in this case, so the state could exercise control on the media to basically ensure that only the right kind of information is given, and all kinds of information not approved by the state or proper health agencies like the World Health Organization, so they don't get into the information flow, or rumors are not spread. And this is particularly challenging in the new, as I said, in this century, where electronic communication is so prevalent, so easy, so cheap. So anyone can spread anything, and especially as they say, rumors spread faster than light. So, but at the same time, the same technological advancement can also be used to somehow track the origins, the mischief makers. So the origins, the sources of the particular message or the rumor. So that was there, but then the problem was that by the time that is done, there is already some measure of damage done by the kind of fear, anxiety created in some sections of the people. So that's why, so we have to even talk about misinformation itself as an epidemic. So which this misinformation, which is a peculiar problem of this, ironically, problem of the age of information, age of communication. So this epidemic can spread even further and faster than actual epidemic diseases. So there are some differences between the way the challenges unfolded. One of the important aspects of the said act of 1897, it doesn't have adequate safeguards against abuse of power. So it says the state can do this, state can do that, and citizens should not do this or prevented from this. They can be prohibited from that and all that. So it is more looks like more state centric and not in favor of citizens, or there's no concepts of rights of citizens and all that. And also it's because of the kind of situation, and moreover it's anyway a colonial era act where the colonial state didn't have to particularly worry about things like the rights of the citizens, so they just had to do it and people just had to cooperate. But of course, things are different in the context that we are talking about. So it's not a colonial state who can be so repressive. So we have constitution, we have human rights agencies, and we have fundamental rights and things like that. So therefore, but still, so that doesn't change the fact that many of them are very harsh, difficult to bear. All of us have been through it, and they were seen as repressions. Many felt that they were being harassed by the police, stopped, or even arrested when they were going for even doing purchase of basic needs, which was legitimate. So, of course, as I said, there's a difference in the nature of the state. So we have a republic with constitutional rights guaranteed and other such things. And also among the citizens is there's a different era where there's a greater realization and consciousness, say even after the coming of the constitution and the republic, so there's a greater consciousness now than compared to say the people living in the villages in the 1960s. So even now, because of the spread of information, all these other technologies and awareness creation, the rise in the levels of literacy and all that, so there is a greater realization of rights among people, and there is a greater tendency to question. Of course, they understand that this is an emergency, but still people, the population was expecting some level of moderation. So that is why on the other side also, the state side also, they realized it. So it's not colonial times, or it's not even like 1960s. So we are in the 21st century. So sometimes police, rather than enforcing strictly and arresting, they had to cajole. So why not you please stay at home? Why are you bringing your scooter out? Don't you understand? Don't you realize it's not just about you? Don't you realize that your family may be affected when you go back now? You don't know what you would have carried. So, three people in your house may be affected. Your elderly parents might be affected. So, those kinds of cajoling, or even when they punish, they give very innovative punishments, like in front of media and the glare of the camera, say they're asked to sit down and rise up as they do in temples. So do it like 20 times, 30 times, that kind of punishment exercises, or take some oath. I so and so hereby promise that I will not venture out of my house unless and needed for emergency. I realize my mistake, and I also request all my fellow citizens, those kinds of things, which fulfill the double purpose. So one is a kind of punishment and embarrassment, but also a kind of awareness creation simultaneously for others, watching it on TV or social media. And of course, again, so because of the different kind of situation we are in, so people were not, so women were not separated by force from their husband, or children, or dragged, or no one was violently dragged without being, so people were properly told this is the procedure, this we have to do, and this is the number of days you have to be at this quarantine station, these things. And in fact, communication was allowed with the family, so people could carry their cell phone also. And so that is again another, for all the evils and problems that cell phone can engender. So one thing is, at least when you're standing in a queue, or at an isolation, so at least it gives you some company, it reduces the pain. But in spite of all this very different kind of softened approach and the cajoling approach, so even our own government was seen as being oppressive. So all this I'm saying so that you can imagine the kind of problem that the colonial state would have felt in terms of winning the trust and cooperation of the people. So here itself we saw, so in spite of our government doing all the information campaign, trying to be as moderate as possible, so people still rushed to railway stations. We saw it all vividly on camera. So kind of, especially workers who wanted to, in spite of all kinds of assurance, local government's assurance, people wanted to go back home. So of course, all those cultural elements, so that kind of anxiety about how their elderly parents are back home. So even if I die, so we should all die together. So that kind of cultural sense of attachment. So, and we also came across people like, as we saw in the case of the plague, so people would sometimes even hide the dead body inside the house, and conceal information. So similarly here also, so even after a century, so people had the same attitude. Um, so they concealed the symptoms because of the fear that then they may be subject to COVID test and then taken for quarantine and things like that. So the state needed a lot more work on that front in terms of convincing, inspiring trust and cooperation, because it couldn't act like the colonial state. So even the colonial state also, it couldn't act too repressively, as we saw, like they always had 1857 and other things in mind. And any sensible government will not depend too much on repression, but at least they had the option of not being too sensitive to people's sensibilities. But here, for the various factors I said, the government had to, and even vaccination was not made compulsory. Uh, uh, so it was rather done by persuasion, by media campaign, and even public health officials visiting households and trying to educate the people. And vaccines also were available freely. Of course, they were available in private hospitals where people could, those who could afford, could go and do it, especially in quick time. But for those who couldn't afford, so the state made it available free in several places, and special drives were launched, weekly drives, Sunday vaccination, and such drives are going very closer to the people areas where centers where people lived or would congregate. So in this context, you can recall the peculiar effective method adopted by the Bombay presidency during the smallpox vaccination campaign. So when they proactively went in search of people and gave most of it freely. Um, so though it was not made compulsory, but people were made to feel somewhat awkward and odd if you are not vaccinated, because everyone was getting vaccinated, and even when the public health officials came home, even if they asked, and if you say no, they would indirectly make you feel that something is wrong and we are on the wrong side. And of course, there are other ways in which it was made compulsory. For instance, only those who were vaccinated were allowed. So when things were some relaxations were made, so lockdown was being relaxed when travels resumed. So it was mandatory in most places that people boarding flights or trains should have vaccinations, or at least one dose. Then even for sometimes people going for, say, examination duties, so they told, so if so many people are applying for that, so if they gave preference for those who had both doses already. Um, so that's so in an indirect way, it was made compulsory. And of course, now there was a better collection of information about vaccination, about the availability, about the supply. Of course, as I been saying, so information management, information data collection is very important. We've been talking about vital statistics, registration, and such things. So, so healthcare generally is better done if things are better known, better organized data is available. So, in this particular case, there was a very robust database. So, every person was vaccinated, say for in India. So, there was a national database. Anyone at any level of government can see. Uh, there's a national database. And so one more important thing which we can also connect to historical times was, so vaccine was produced in India, for India, and also for abroad. So we came across how in fact, the vaccine was invented in India. So even in this case, it was not invented in India, but of course, it was produced on a large scale in India, the COVID vaccine. But plague vaccine, so Hafkin came up with his own plague vaccine, which was originally invented in India, and of course, it was produced not only for use in India, but also to be sent particularly to other British colonial possessions elsewhere. And similarly, there was a important role played by various propaganda agencies to promote awareness, and media was particularly relevant with all its appeals, constant appeals to get vaccinated, to maintain isolation, to maintain social distance, to follow precautionary measures, wearing of masks, all that. So social media as well, as much as it can be mischievous, spreading false information. So it was also a source of comfort. So people could feel that solidarity, that if we do these certain things, things could be under control. So some amount of anxiety reduced.